Today, I'm going to be showing you a few techniques that will make the skiver a lot less frustrating and so much more efficient. That's coming up. Hello everyone, my name is Daniel Reach. This is Weaver Leather Supply. Today, we're going to be talking about one of the things that we all love to hate, and that's skiving. It's one of those techniques that you need to learn, but at the same time, it can be frustrating. It can be pretty easy to get wrong, and if you're not careful, you can ruin projects with it really quickly. But with a few basic techniques and strategies, it's really not that bad. So first thing first, as always, we want to make sure that we got a fresh blade in the skiver every single time. Now, most of you knew that, but what you might not know is that you might have to swap that blade out in the middle of skiving. Now, why would you need to do this? Well, some leathers can be really tough to pull a blade through, and that means that they're really rough on the blade itself, and they dull it down pretty quickly. So if you find yourself having to put more force on it and you're really working a lot harder than you had to in the beginning with the fresh blade, that's a pretty good indication that you want to swap that blade out again. So how do we actually swap the blade out without, being at risk of cutting ourselves? Because these blades are sharp. I use a pair of needle nose pliers and my thumb. I just want to keep those pliers between my thumb and the blade. And I'm going to push on the edge of the blade so it slips out. Then I'm going to pull it out with the pliers and grab a new blade. Then, again, using the pliers, I'm going to reseat that blade into the slot. The big thing is we want to make sure that we keep the pliers between our thumb and the blade. So the next thing would be we want to make sure that our leather is bone dry. Now, I don't mean like sit it out in the sun and cook it or anything like that. I mean just don't add water to it. And the reason we want to do this is because as we're trying to skive, damp leather tends to flex and move out of the way of the leather, where dry leather doesn't do that. It kind of holds its shape, it holds its position, which gives the blade a chance to bite into the leather. Wet leather is much more problematic when it comes to that. So don't case your leather before you try to skive it. So the third thing is that we want to make sure that we're using a hard surface to skive on. Glass is ideal, but most of us don't have just glass laying around and we're not comfortable with it because, it has a tendency to break and shatter and get everywhere. So I like to use the granite that I tool on. The reason I do this, if you use, let's say, a cutting board versus granite. Well, granite, as that blade drops off the edge of the belt or whatever it is that we're skiving, that blade just slides right along the granite. If we're using something soft like a cutting board or plastic to skive on, well, what happens is that blade tends to dig into it. It bites into that plastic. Not only does that mess up the surface that we're skiving on, but it's really rough on the blade. This shot right here is a great example of what I'm talking about. I left the craft paper on my granite, and as the blade came off the leather, it skipped and bit into the paper. And if that had been something softer like plastic or a cutting board, it would have really bit into that. The reason this is such a big deal is because number one, we don't want to ruin the surface that we're working on. And number two, when it bites into it like that, it's really rough on the blade, which means it's going to dramatically shorten the life of that blade, and you're just going to have to keep swapping them out. So now that we've got a good foundation, we can actually start skiving leather. And the first thing that I would tell you is that we want that blade to sit roughly at a 45-degree angle. It doesn't have to be exact, but we don't want to be coming at it perpendicular. We want to be on a little bit of an angle, roughly 45 degrees. So there's a couple of different places that we typically would skive leather. One is going to be the edges. So that's going to be the right, left, and the front, if you want to call it that. The other would be the inner, more flat part of the leather. Now, if I'm going to be skiving one of the edges, I'm going to use this curved part of the skiver. And what that does for me, it creates an automatic taper, which is what we're looking for on the edges. So by using that upward curve, I don't have to work to get the taper that I'm looking for. It just naturally does it for me. Now, if I'm skiving the inner flat part of it where I'm just trying to thin it out and I'm not trying to create a taper towards the edge, I'm just gradually wanting it to taper off towards the end. Well, for that, I'm going to use the bottom curve of the skiver right here, and that's because it tends to bite in a little bit better. If you're having to force the blade through the leather, that tells you that you've got one of two issues that you need to address. The first one we've already talked about. You might need a fresh blade. The other one would be that you don't have it sitting at that 45-degree angle that we talked about. You're coming at it more of a flat pull instead of an angled pull. So I hope you found that helpful. Hopefully it's going to make skiving your projects a lot easier. That's going to do it for this video. I will see you in the next one. In the meantime, go make something amazing.